Are you a manager who's struggling to find talent in today's competitive market? Or are you on the other end where you're facing a hiring freeze and your manager and your company is basically asking you to do more with less people and less resources? If you're in either of these situations, you're not alone. In this episode, I'm going to shed some light on the 4 biggest challenges facing managers right now. We're going to explore what these challenges are and what's causing them. Then we're going to take a look at how each of these problems is impacting team performance, employee engagement, and workplace culture. At the end, I'm going to give you some resources to help you overcome these challenges. But first, just let me quickly introduce myself, just in case you're new to the channel. My name is Doug Howard. I'm a licensed engineer, and I'm also a leadership coach and consultant. And I use my YouTube channel to help managers and leaders like you level up your leadership skills. What I do is I place a heavy emphasis on the people side of management, because at the end of the day, that's what management is all about. You need to understand how to motivate, influence, and inspire people to do more and to get more out of your people. That's what leadership is. If you want the best tools, tips, and insights on how to do this, make sure you subscribe to my channel. This episode is going to focus on 4 unique problems that are happening right now in our industry, but it's not just engineering industries, it's all industries. But I'm going to focus on how this is impacting engineering specifically and how it's affecting engineering managers and tech leaders. Now, the first problem is a shrinking workforce. Basically, you just can't find qualified people right now. This has been a trend going on for about a decade, or at least that's how I've noticed it in my 10 years as a manager and as a director. Just reverse engineering what's going on here. There's a few things that are causing this problem of not being able to find qualified people. It's pretty obvious when you think about it, but it might not be to everyone, so I just want to call it out right away. The first thing is there's been a lot of rapid technology advancements over the last 10 to 20 years. The downstream effect is that today you're seeing a lot more specialization in skill requirements. For example, in the past, let's go back in time 20 years, a lot of the skills that people were doing at their job weren't very new. They were skills that have been around for a while. They were tools that have been around for a while. So there were a lot more people that have built up those skills. There were just a lot more people available that have had experience working in that. Even if they weren't working in it recently, they had touched those skills or those tools or those techniques or those softwares or whatever. They have touched that earlier in their career, so they were able to have more transferable skills and background knowledge and experience. Where today, let's just take a look at artificial intelligence just for an example. That has not been around that long as far as mainstream engineering goes and mainstream STEM. So there just aren't that many people with background experience who are qualified to just jump into that market and hit the ground running. When you think about this relationship throughout all industries and how much the way we do work has changed, there's this big specialization gap that's been created. Meanwhile, a lot of the skills that are routine and task-based, a lot of those are becoming automated or they're getting outsourced, they're offshored. So there's just this relationship here where the way we do work has changed, and because of the technology advancements, there's also just been this huge specialization shift that you may not realize because it's been slightly gradual over the last decade. But if you compare and contrast today versus a decade ago or prior, you'll notice a huge difference. Now, another main factor that's causing this is a disconnect between the STEM education pipeline with respect to the amount of tech jobs that have been created. If you look over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a huge boom in tech. Companies that are household names today didn't even exist 20 years ago. Most of the biggest companies in the world are tech companies or engineering companies. The reason I'm pointing this out is there's been a huge increase in tech jobs over that time frame, over the last 10 to 20 years. But there has not been that same level of increase in tech professionals entering the workforce. There has not been an increase in people going to school to get engineering degrees, at least not in that same rate. If anything, there might be a slight decline in that as well. So you have this increased demand as far as tech jobs. When I say tech, engineering, STEM, there's been this huge increase in tech jobs and this demand for them, but there hasn't been this same inflow of people entering the workforce over the last 10 years. So you're starting to see this big drop off now where there just literally aren't enough people to do the jobs. At the same time, we had this little thing called COVID a few years ago, and it caused the Great Resignation. So you've also just seen a big wave of people who were in the beginning to middle of their engineering career or their STEM career, and they just left the industry. Maybe they started a side hustle or started their own business or switched professional career paths altogether. You're seeing a mix of these things that are causing this gaps that there just simply doesn't seem to be enough people qualified to do the job. What this has done is it's created a downstream impact where there's increased competition for talent across industries. And All companies are now fighting over the same limited resources, the same limited people. It's like animals going to a watering hole that doesn't have enough water to feed everybody. It's created this highly competitive environment where companies are increasing their salary just to get the same level of work out of someone. They're increasing their salary per position just to poach someone from another company, to get them to want to leave, to lure them away. On a more personal note on this, all the people I work with, my clients and the companies I work with, I've worked with engineering managers and tech leaders and directors. All of them are seeing the same thing. They spend months trying to find a qualified candidate. They don't really find the person they're looking for, but eventually they just got to make a move. So they take a chance on someone who seemed okay in the interview. But then once they started working for the company, it's a different story. That person doesn't have the skills that they needed to do the job, or maybe they have the technical skills, but the professionalism is lacking. They don't show up to work on time, or they don't stay until the project's done. Within a few months, that person's quitting, or it's not working out, and they're ending up having to fire that person. It's creating this revolving door effect too. It's this never-ending cycle. So the reason I'm sharing that is because the whole idea here is, how is this impacting your team? How is this impacting you as a manager? How is this impacting your product or whatever service it is you're offering? What I want to point out here is that because it's so challenging to source qualified people, the hiring cycle is getting prolonged and it's getting stretched out. This dominoes into indefinitely long periods of increased workloads for your existing team. What this means is, it sounds temporary, but it ends up becoming this indefinite period where everyone on your team is expected to do someone else's job on top of their own just to keep up. This isn't like a busy month or something like that. This ends up happening for months, maybe years, especially if you have this revolving door environment where the person never really gets up to speed. What I want to point out here is when you're in this type of cycle, there's 3 phases to it. As I explain them, I want you to think about, where do you and your team fall within these 3 phases. Phase 1 is the short term. This is where you'll see initial stress and overwhelm throughout your team. It's going to lead to communication breakdowns, frustration, conflicts, missed deadlines. It's obviously not good, but the damage isn't permanent either. You can usually bend but don't break type of thing. There's going to be a few eggs that drop, but at the same time, you're still able to make the omelet. Phase 2 is the medium term. Think more 1 quarter or 2 quarters. This is where it gets a little worse, because you start seeing burnout throughout your team. So in that first phase, it was just stress and overwhelm, maybe some heated moments or something like that. People aren't exhausted. People aren't burning out. Now you're starting to see people burn out, and you're starting to see people's attitudes change. And this is going to lead to compromised team dynamics and product quality, where people aren't feeling as compelled to put in as much effort because they just don't have much more effort to give. Mistakes will start slipping through the cracks. And some of these mistakes aren't fixable. These are things where, it reaches your customer, and all of a sudden maybe this customer doesn't want to do business with your company anymore because they think this is the type of work they're going to get. Or maybe if you're in structural engineering, maybe there was a flaw in a design, or there was a failure or something like that. You're starting to see this stuff happen. Meanwhile, then, because there's this brewing toxic work environment where everyone's stretched pretty thin and overstressed, everyone's going to start pointing the finger at each other instead of working together to solve the problem. They're going to break off into silos. And, not my job. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. Now, quick sidebar. Burnout is a real problem for engineers right now, engineering managers and engineering teams. If burnout is a problem for you or your team, then I want you to check out my episode called Overcoming Burnout in Engineering and Tech. I interviewed with a mindset coach expert who specializes in helping software developers with burnout, and he gives a lot of great tips for how to manage this. These are tips that you can use for yourself as a manager and for your team. So I'll drop a link to that episode in the description here. But moving on, phase 3, this is the longer term. Now, this is where the consequences are even worse, because the longer this environment continues, the more it permanently impacts your team's culture, your team's morale, and their motivation. So now just think about this. You're talking about permanently changing the culture because this type of environment is going on so long. Obviously, this isn't good, but there's also a catch-22 that causes everything to snowball even worse. Wrong or indifferent, the reality of the situation is that you need to produce more with less resources. I'm not saying it's fair that you have to like it, but that's what's happening in this environment that we're describing here. To get out of that, that requires creative solutions and innovative solutions and new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. But when you're working in this type of overstressed environment, it's not conducive to innovation or creativity. So there's really nothing to break this downward cycle you're in. There's nothing to break the cycle that the team is in either. Everyone just gets tunnel vision. They either accept it as the way it is, they start quiet quitting, they give up, they figure, why bother bringing anything up? Nothing's going to change. And you develop that mentality too as a leader. Now all of a sudden everyone's just in zombie mode, and there's really no way to dig yourself out of this. This is all caused by that first problem we were talking about, which is the shrinking workforce. The second problem I want to cover here is on the other end of the spectrum, and this is hiring freezes. So the first problem we just talked about is related to not being able to find qualified people. This problem is the exact opposite. You need people, but your company isn't letting you hire anybody. Both of these problems have the exact same impact, which is your boss telling you to produce more with less. On that note, if your manager's a real jerk, you should check out my episode called How to Deal with a Toxic Boss, because I give you some tangible tips that teach you how to deal with a toxic boss without quitting. I'll drop a link in the description. Getting back to this problem of a hiring freeze, basically know you need more people, but your company isn't letting you hire anybody. This dichotomy where companies are demanding more productivity while pulling back resources is caused by a couple things. It's a mix of economic downturns with uncertain market conditions. Whenever this happens, companies get real conservative and they're going to control costs and they're going to conserve resources. Companies don't like when they don't have control. I'm sure you realize this already in many regards, but I'm just explaining this in a different light because it might be common sense, but the point I want to emphasize is that this is a cycle that happens over and over again in business. You're in a leadership position, which means you need to know how to effectively manage through it. There's a couple of different things. First, you need to know how to manage upward and influence upward. I have an episode that teaches you how to do that as well. I'll drop a link to that episode in the episode description if you want to check that out. It's called How to Influence Upward, Downward, and Cross-Functionally. But my point here is this is going to happen over and over again. The impact of the hiring freeze is very similar to the impact of the shrinking workforce. So I'm not going to really go any deeper because it's all the things I just described in that first problem. Now, the third problem is a huge one that might not be on your radar because it slips under the rug and you don't really notice the impact it's having. The third problem is generational gaps. There are huge generational gaps on most teams today, if not all teams. Today's leaders basically need to be translators when you think of it this way, because for the first time in history, we have 4 generations that each make up a sizable percentage of the workforce. The impact is that this creates a diverse spectrum of communication preferences, core values, working styles, expectations, you name it. And it creates a diversity throughout your team and throughout your company. Let's take a quick look at the unique differences between each of these generations, just in case we're not on the same page. The first generation is the baby boomers. These are people born approximately between 1946 and 1964. These people are in their 50s to 70s right now. Their values are optimism, they're team-oriented, they value personal growth, and they value a work-centric identity. That means they really feel connected with what they do. When they introduce themselves to somebody, they say, "Hi, I'm Tim, I'm an engineer. Hi, I'm John, I'm an architect." That's part of their identity. Their communication style. They prefer meetings, phone calls, emails. They value direct and personal interaction with people because that's how communication was for the majority of their lifespan, especially their core working years when they entered the workforce through the middle part of their career. We didn't have DMs and chats and all things like this. So they're really comfortable with that in-person, face-to-face interaction. Now, as far as work expectations go, they're very work-centric. Work comes first, and they value job titles. They won't admit this, but they're seeking acknowledgement and recognition. They want to be rewarded for the hard work they're putting in. They want to be recognized as an expert if they're an expert in their field. They value that external validation, so to speak. The next generation is Gen X. These are the people born between 1965 and 1980. So these people range somewhere in their 40s to 50s right now. This generation places a high value on work-life balance, independence, adaptability, and skepticism. Before I continue, I just want to point, we already have a contrast in the two generations. The first generation is very work-centric. This one values work-life balance. So there's a contrast there. We're going to explain how this impacts your team here in a moment. Independence, adaptability, and skepticism for values. Their communication style. They prefer emails and instant messaging. So you're starting to see this generation start to embrace technology a little bit. They value work efficiency. As far as work expectations go, they value flexibility. They're going to want feedback. And they're going to seek a good balance between work life and personal life. The next generation is Millenials, also known as Generation Y. These people are born between 1981 and 1996. Their values are diversity, collaboration. They want to work with a purpose. They want their work to have meaning. They value technology. They appreciate what technology can do. As far as communication style goes, they prefer digital communication, social media, texting, DMing, and that's what we're most comfortable with. For work expectations, there's a high value in work-life integration. So where Gen X wants work-life balance, millennials don't really see a divide between personal life and work. It's more like integrated. If there's a Wi-Fi set up nearby, they can work. So they're also seeking purposeful work. They desire rapid career progression too. They don't see any reason why they can't accelerate their careers faster. They don't look at time as the same way as baby boomers do or as Gen X does. Now, the last generation, the youngest one, is Gen Z. These are people born between 1997 and 2012. So these people, at least the ones that are in their workforce, they're in their 20s right now. Their values are, they're very entrepreneurial. They're digital natives. They grew up in a digital environment. So this gives them an entirely different perspective than every other previous generation. Things like social media is a norm for them. They don't know life without it. They don't know analog life, so to speak. They have to intentionally learn these things. And I'm going to come back to that idea. The other things they value are authenticity and social consciousness. As far as their communication style goes, they prefer everything fast. So they want instant messaging. They like video content. They like collaboration tools like Teams and Slack and WhatsApp, anything that has like ongoing collaboration digitally. As far as work expectations go, they're looking for diversity. They're looking for diverse opportunities. They place a high value on independence and working alone and working independently. They, believe it or not, do desire clear expectations and mentorship, even if they don't show it. They like being guided, they like being told how to do things, but there's this dichotomy with them that they don't like seeking help at the same time. So it's an interesting contrast. Gen Z seems to be the generation that most people in the workforce today are struggling to understand and struggling to figure out how to lead. So just while we're on the topic of Gen Z, if you're struggling to manage the younger generation, you should check out my episode called Bridging the Gap with Gen Z. I included a link in the description. Now, let's talk about how this impacts your leadership style and your management style. You cannot effectively lead or manage people unless you understand them. That means understanding their perspective. How do they view the situation? How do they view the problem? What motivates them? How are they influenced? How do they like to learn? How do they like to be coached? You can't effectively lead or manage people unless you understand what makes them tick. Managing today's workforce requires adaptive leadership styles to accommodate for all these different generational preferences that we just talked about. You need to truly understand each person on your team, which includes understanding these generational differences between them. If you ignore this, and if you expect other people to conform to your way or to the previous way, it's just going to result in conflicts, dissatisfaction, lack of clarity, and more importantly, lack of effective leadership across your diverse team. You're not going to be able to effectively lead them or manage them. This trickles into team culture because if you don't manage these dynamics well, generational differences will continue leading to a fragmented team culture. Fostering a cohesive and inclusive environment becomes a lot more challenging when you have different generations that have conflicting values and work styles. Here's real-life examples to illustrate how intergenerational differences cause misunderstandings, conflicts, and lack of cohesion with your team. The story I want to share just shows you the difference in values between millennials and baby boomers. So this is actually from years ago when I was a manager. There was a person on my team who was really excited to buy a new release of shoes. I'm not into fashion or anything like that, but he was. He really liked staying up on things. There was this new shoe release that was coming out at 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Limited sizes available and things like that. I don't know all the details of it. The point is he had to be on his computer to buy these at 8 a.m. So right at 8 a.m., he's on his work computer. He's getting his credit card out and buying these shoes. Well, he sat next to someone who was a baby boomer, and the baby boomer saw him shopping on company time. He thought this was unacceptable. You can't do that. He yelled at him here in the cubicle in front of everybody. People could hear this. I'm arriving to work around this time. I just hear this thing blowing up. I hear them arguing, shouting at each other. Why do you care what I'm doing? This is my personal business. This has nothing to do with you. You're working on company time. You shouldn't be doing that. I'm not going to go on and rehash this whole thing. This thing really escalated quickly, all because someone was making a quick purchase on to buy shoes that they had to get at a certain time before they were sold out. Now, if you're a millennial watching this, or if you're a Gen Z person watching this, you probably side with the person who was buying the shoes. Meanwhile, if you're a Gen X person or a baby boomer, you're hearing this thinking, yeah, you shouldn't have been doing that on company time. I'm not here to say either side is right or wrong, but what I'm pointing out here is these types of things are happening all day. Everyone's observing each other and they're making judgments about other people's actions and their behaviors because their preferences and their natural ways of communicating and their natural views on work-life balance are different. This is what creates all these schisms in your department. I was fortunate enough to see this thing happen because as a manager, I could address it. I pulled both people together. We talked about it. We talked through it. We created a mutual understanding on this topic, and it really helped bridge these two people together, honestly. But a lot of times these things don't blow up to the surface and you don't see them happen. What happens in most scenarios is that baby boomer doesn't say anything. He just keeps it up here. He's all annoyed at that person. He doesn't like that person now. He thinks that person's lazy. That's how these things fester and create a toxic work culture in your environment without you even realizing it as a manager. If you want to make sure these types of problems don't go unnoticed on your team, check out my episode called Hidden Challenges When Managing Teams with Generational Gaps. In this episode, I go a lot deeper into understanding the unique differences between each generation. I also give a lot more examples of how this manifests problems on your team. I'll drop a link to that episode in the description of this one. The fourth and final problem is lack of leadership training. In my humble opinion, this is the biggest issue of all four because it exacerbates the previous three problems we covered in this episode. It amplifies the impact that those problems have because basically leaders today aren't equipped with the tools, the training, or the knowledge that they need to manage their people or to navigate through any of these challenges we just talked about. Here's how it starts. Most managers, they get promoted into their first leadership position based on their technical performance rather than their leadership capabilities. Here's the problem with that. Moving from individual contributor to manager, it's not a promotion. It's a career shift because it requires a completely different set of skills relative to the skills that made you a top performing engineer or any type of individual contributor role. There's not a linear path there. It's a shift. It's a transition, which means it requires new skills. If you never learn the critical foundational management skills, then you'll never be an effective leader. Just like you wouldn't have been an effective engineer without having foundational engineering skills. So here's what happens. That manager, patient zero, we'll call it, that manager gets promoted without ever receiving any leadership training. Years later, they promote an engineer into a leadership position without giving them any leadership training because they don't know any better. This creates an endless cycle of undertrained managers, and it happens over and over again. I go a lot deeper into this idea of this leadership cycle in my episode called How the Bad Leadership Cycle in Engineering is Burning Out Engineers and Stifling Innovation. If you want to check that out, I'll add a link in the description for you. You don't need me to tell you that it's not a good thing when leaders aren't trained on basic foundational management skills. But I want to focus on 6 main areas where lack of management shows up the most. As I walk through these, I want you to think about how you'd rank yourself in each of these areas. First is team performance. Managers lacking training will struggle to set clear objectives and provide guidance that aligns your team's efforts with broader organizational goals. When you don't know how to effectively communicate with all types of people, it hinders the flow of information, which creates ambiguity. And that ambiguity leads to confusion, demotivation, and a lack of productivity throughout your team that impacts task execution and project outcomes. The second area is employee retention. Managers who are not trained on how to mentor and coach your team and who don't know the right way to acknowledge and show appreciation for your team's efforts and adapting to all the different generational styles and preferred ways of communicating and receiving that validation, those managers are not going to be able to give their team the support and the guidance and the encouragement that they need. That's just going to result in disengagement, decreased job satisfaction, and increased turnover. All bad things. When you don't understand the unique learning style of each person on your team, it leads to inadequate training methods and ineffective employee development strategies that are basically a waste of time. Now, this type of environment we're talking about makes your employees feel stagnant and feels like they don't have any opportunities for growth. It provokes them to start looking for other opportunities, which results in higher turnover. The third area is company culture. Managers are pivotal in shaping the culture on your team, but managers who aren't trained unintentionally create toxic work environments without even realizing it because favoritism, unfairness, and lack of empathy becomes the norm. You end up relating to the people that are similar to you, and you end up ostracizing the people that you don't understand. For example, if you are a Gen X manager, you're going to end up ostracizing the Gen Zers on your team without even realizing it because you're going to look at it like their way is wrong and my way is right. You're going to be subconsciously favoring the other Gen Xers on your team and the baby boomers, maybe if you can relate to them more. Do you see how this works? Obviously, if you're managing this way without realizing it, it's going to impact your team's morale and your overall culture on your team too. It's going to create a very divided team culture. The fourth area I want to look at is conflict resolution. Managers that lack key conflict resolution skills are going to struggle and spin their wheels when you're addressing disputes and disagreements on your team. Instead of resolving those conflicts, you're going to unintentionally escalate them, which obviously has a negative impact on team dynamics and productivity. I'll go back to that story I told you about the millennial person on my team who wanted to buy shoes at 8 a.m. and then the boomer didn't think that was okay. He thought, this is company time, you can't do that. Now, had I just blindly sided with the baby boomer on my team, that millennial was going to feel very ostracized. They're going to feel like I didn't get them. They probably weren't going to want to continue working for someone like me. They weren't going to feel comfortable with bringing things up to me either. On the other hand, they weren't going to feel comfortable with being honest with me about things. Instead, they're going to probably just try to hide types of things that I wasn't okay with, like maybe watching Netflix on company time or something like that. But instead, because I handled it in a way that I showed I understood both people's perspectives and I helped them understand each other's perspective, both sides were comfortable with each other and with coming to me to talk about these things and to figure out what is acceptable behavior at work and what isn't, versus hiding it and just assuming I wouldn't understand. But getting back on point here, if you ignore these things, it creates a bigger problem because it creates lingering tensions among team members. That's a breeding ground for a toxic work environment. That leads me to the fifth area, which is performance appraisals and feedback. Untrained managers put themselves at risk of conducting performance reviews inadequately, whether it's not giving enough feedback or not giving feedback the right way because you're focusing on the wrong things. Either way, this leads to inaccurate performance reviews that demotivate your team because your team doesn't feel recognized for their contributions. When they're not receiving constructive feedback for improvement, they're not going to improve. Without proper feedback mechanisms in place, your team is going to lack the guidance on the key areas and their blind spots that they need to figure out for improvement. Obviously, that's going to hinder their professional growth and their potential. Which leads me to the sixth and final area, which is adaptability and change management. Tools and tech are evolving faster than ever, which means companies are always going to be putting a lot of pressure on their managers to implement changes to new systems and processes. But people are human, and humans fear the uncertainty of change. We talked about that at the very beginning of this episode, how companies fear that, and that's why they lock up their budgets and control their resources when there's unpredictable things in the economy. That's human nature. That's what we do. We don't like the uncertainty of change. So when your company is asking you to make changes, your team is most likely going to default to change with resistance. This is the way we've always done it. This is what works. Why are we doing this different? Why are we trying that new software? Why are we doing that new thing? If you don't know how to handle change management, you're going to struggle to guide your team through these transitions. We covered a lot of information here. We jumped around a little bit, but the idea is these are the four main problems that are impacting your ability as an engineering manager, and all managers for that matter, to do your job, because we weren't trained on how to handle these unique situations. We're navigating a shrinking workforce, but at the same time, companies are limiting our budget and not giving us the resources we need and the people we need to do our jobs effectively. Then you combine that with these generational gaps where you basically need to be a translator and understanding how to speak to four different generations in a way that resonates with them and aligning these communication styles and work values to work cohesively together. This all gets exacerbated by lack of leadership training. Our leaders today have not been trained on these skills that they need to manage these situations effectively. It's a new environment with new problems and a unique mix of problems that's making this all challenging. I'm reiterating all that because you can't solve a problem unless you're actually clear on what the problem is. That's why I wanted to use this episode to focus on clarifying and understanding why managers today are facing a unique combination of challenges that previous generations of managers didn't have to deal with. Now that you're aware of these challenges, you're probably wondering, what can I do about it? If that sounds like you should check out my episode called How Managers Can Effectively Lead a Shrinking Workforce with Huge Generational Gaps.